The threat that counterfeiters pose on Amazon is a real one, but do you know how to spot them or what options you have for removing them both on and off of Amazon? Stay tuned to find out. Today on E-Commerce Heroes, I'll be talking to Susie Hickson. Susie is an intellectual property lawyer, the founder of the Private Label Lawyer, and an Amazon seller herself. We'll be talking about how to protect your Amazon listings from counterfeiters, including how to spot what type of counterfeiter is targeting you, and, most importantly, how to get them removed. So, Susie, what types of counterfeiters are there on Amazon, and how do you know which type is targeting you?
Well, Alex, we see a couple different types of counterfeiters. The biggest ones, or I guess the most prominent would be the best way to say it, that we're seeing are China-based counterfeiters. And it's pretty obvious when you're dealing with a China-based counterfeiter. A lot of times when you look at their seller name, it's kind of a senseless, it's like ABC XYZ seller 123. It's not like a legitimate business name like you would find for a US based seller. So that's how you can kind of tell if you're dealing with a China based counterfeiter. If you are manufacturing your goods only in the US and your distribution channels have only been in the US, you can be pretty sure that you're going to be dealing with counterfeits if that seller is based in China. Now, another thing that we see a lot of too are sellers who they're not technically counterfeit. I do call them hijackers, but they're selling on a listing a product that they might have gotten through legal distribution channels, but unauthorized by the brand owner. So they're kind of gray market goods. Now, there's ways to get both of these types of sellers removed from listings. The counterfeiters that are direct from China tend to be a little bit easier to remove because it's a little bit easier to show to Amazon the specific differences in the goods, right? Like we're usually seeing differences in quality, constructions, minor size differences, and distortions of logos. There are subtle differences, but once you find them and start learning to spot them, they become more obvious. Now, as for the gray market goods, in those situations, those sellers, their products wouldn't be eligible for, a rebate that could, like a manufacturer's rebate. The products wouldn't be eligible for post-purchase customer service or a warranty. So those are some material differences that we can use in an argument to get those third parties off of listings as well.
Okay, and as well as sort of being aware of who might be targeting you, there's been a lot of talk recently about registering a trademark and applying for Brand Registry 2.0. How effective can these be in protecting your products from counterfeiters?
Well, I can speak from the position of a trademark attorney that registering that trademark is one of the best things you can do to be proactive about protecting your brand on and off of Amazon. And one thing I really, want to drive home to people is the importance of building the brand not just on Amazon, right? Like it's kind of a holistic approach to building your brand on and off the platform. So the trademark registration is just sort of the first step in that process of building your brand and building brand recognition. And I do understand and appreciate and can harp on the point or the fact that registration is very important. In the US, we recognize what's called common law rights to trademarks. So you start developing rights to your trademarks as soon as you first start using the trademark, which is pretty cool, whereas other countries it's first to file. So, if you started using your trademark, that's okay, that's good. Go ahead and get that application on file as soon as you can. because it can take at least 8 months to register, and that's on a good day. So, one thing I want to really point out is that the USPTO goes through an examination process. Just because you file your trademark doesn't mean you're going to be granted a registration tomorrow. There is a fairly rigorous examination process with the USPTO where they look at separate, aspects of your trademark, and they can refuse registration on any number of bases. And then after that process, assuming the examining attorney at the USPTO approves your application, the next step is that it's published. And that period is a 30-day kind of window where third parties can oppose registration of your trademark. Now, in opposition is an exception. It doesn't happen all that often, but it can happen. It can hold up your trademark. So just keep that in mind that, if you're using your trademark in the U.S., it is better to go ahead and file as soon as you can, because again, you do start developing your rights as of the first date that you started using it, but that process does take a long time. Now, as for the brand registry, Amazon alleges that it gives you more control over your product pages and your brand on the platform. Now, I think it's important to enroll in brand registry once you get your mark registered, but I'm not seeing yet a lot of really practical tools for sellers to help them protect and enforce their brands at this point. I've not had any clients that have come to me and, you've been particularly thrilled with brand registry. Although, it exists, and, as long as you review the terms associated with the brand registry enrollment, and you agree with those, then, it's something that should be considered if you're on Amazon and you're protecting your trademark. But I think that people put a lot of emphasis on that trademark registration for the sole purpose of brand registry, but your trademark registration gives you so many more benefits than just getting to be eligible for brand registry. So that's just, that's a benefit, but it's not the sole purpose of getting a mark registered.
And if we take that again one step further and we look at actually removing these counterfeiters, what options are there that sellers have on the Amazon platform itself? I mean, what can they do to remove these counterfeiters from Amazon?
This is the fun part. This is where it gets exciting. Depending on the situation, sometimes sellers like to send a demand letter directly to the seller. There could be some benefits in that method. One is that it's not as aggressive, right? As opposed to going straight to Amazon and being like, sending a demand letter, debating them off your listing. It kind of gives them an opportunity to remove themselves from your listing. Maybe you want to give them 48 hours to remove themselves. That's sort of a kind gesture, like a gesture of goodwill, like you're trying to work this out with the seller. You can also frame that letter in a more exploratory way. And not make it super aggressive, like get off my listing, you're infringing. Make it more like, hey, we're just trying to kind of figure out what's going on with this, why you're on our listing, where did you get your product? Now, they might not tell you. Some people will. Some people are like, oh, I got it from this distributor, and you can learn a lot from that exploratory letter. You can learn, if they're willing to give that information. Some people are. You can learn a lot from it. You can find out, maybe you're having an issue with a distributor who is selling your, product or breaking your distribution agreement in some way. So you can, take that as an opportunity to learn. Now, if the seller is based in China, there could be a language barrier. They could ignore you. They could tell you, leave us alone. We're going to keep doing what we're doing. You just don't really know unless you try. Now, the downside of going directly to the seller with that demand letter is that you're losing time, right? The longer they're on your listing, the more sales you are losing. So there are some benefits in just going directly to Amazon. And when you go directly to Amazon, oftentimes Amazon will have that seller off that listing within hours. It kind of depends on the situation. So, I've seen sellers removed, within 30 minutes to an hour. So just keep that in mind that, you could be losing sales, but you could be gaining information if you go directly to the seller. Now, if you go to the seller, you don't get the answer that you want, there's nothing precluding you from then going directly to Amazon with the demand letter. Just a tip about that, when you go directly to Amazon, when you use their online reporting form, you can use the one that's kind of consumer facing, or you can use the one that is available to you in brand registry. Amazon will issue a complaint ID to you. And when you get that complaint ID, save it. Don't just delete the email, because if you have to escalate it and maybe do another demand letter, you might want to have that complaint ID shown in the heading of your correspondence to Amazon, showing that you've been trying proactively to remove the seller, and these are your prior complaints that you submitted.
Okay, and if a seller does both of those things, and they keep getting in contact with Amazon, they've been onto the online form and they're not getting anywhere, what legal options are there for sellers if they're just getting nowhere on Amazon? What can they do off of the platform?
Yeah, so this is where things can get really hairy. If you are dealing, I tend to divide these in China-based and US-based because they do seem to be quite different in the approach. But, if you are dealing with China-based counterfeiter, first of all, Amazon does seem to be more responsive in those situations, okay? Because the platform is somewhat aware of the problem with counterfeits coming from China. So it's unlikely that you're going to have to take it off the platform. What you can do, though, if you have to, of course, you investigate who the seller is. There are ways of investigating who the seller is. You might have to put on your super sleuth glasses to do this. You might have to outsource someone to do the searching investigation for you, but there are ways to do it. If they're based in China, you can send a demand letter, but it's going to be very difficult. I mean, it's going to be very, very difficult to enforce your rights in China. My best piece of advice in that situation is to get a law firm in China on your side to help you enforce. And of course, this comes down to money and how much you're willing to spend on enforcement, and keeping in mind that dealing with China in terms of the counterfeit situation can be like the wild, wild west. There's just not the respect of intellectual property rights that we seem to have in the US and Europe. So just keep that in mind. Now, if you are doing your super sleuthing and you find out that the product is, being counterfeit here in the US, or they're infringing, you can send a demand letter directly to them. A lot of times I encourage, especially in situations where you figure out that you know who that seller is, you try to do the demand letter yourself before you get a law firm involved, as long as, you make sure you're using the appropriate language in that letter. But once you get a law firm involved, it really, really does escalate the situation. And they're going to be more apt at that point to hire a law firm too. So just kind of keep that in mind, that as soon as you get lawyers involved, situations seem to be escalated and unfortunately, in some situations made more complex. And this information, this advice is coming from an attorney, but just something to keep in mind, because it's like a very practical issue that I see out there with people that are, trying to enforce their intellectual property rights off of Amazon.
And I guess that a key element of all of the sleuthing that you might do is establishing proof that the seller in question is actually selling counterfeit goods. So with that in mind, how important is it that you're conducting test buys of any products that you think are counterfeit, so then you can prove to Amazon later on that, these products are fakes?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'll be honest in that I've done a lot of counterfeit seller removals without having done test buys. And maybe that's because the correspondence is coming from a law firm. And I know people that have tried to do counterfeit seller removals without having done test buys, and they seem to kind of run into some issues with that. My advice would be, of course, to consider if a test buy is feasible. If it's not feasible, for example, if the product looks like it would be coming directly from China, you would want to explain to Amazon that the seller is shipping products from China, and that's a place that you don't distribute your brand, and maybe that will work. Now, if a test buy is feasible, go ahead and do it, okay? And then go ahead and submit the demand letter to Amazon. Send in the test buy order number, and then state in the email or the correspondence, photographs will be provided upon request. So even if you don't have those test buys yet, because you, for whatever reason, you see that it's going to take 2 weeks, a month, or whatever, there's nothing wrong with going ahead and submitting the demand if you know that if it's a counterfeit. And again, a counterfeit is when there's a material difference in that product, the infringing product and your product, and that can be shown in many different ways.
Okay, Susie, so taking everything that we've covered in this interview, my final question for you is, what are your e-commerce heroes' top 3 tips to sellers on protecting their listings from counterfeiters?
So my top 3, you're going to limit me to 3, Alex?
I mean, if you've got more, we're happy to hear them.
So my first tip is to file your trademark application. That's your first step in brand protection. And to get the ball rolling on that as soon as possible, because like I said, it could take at least 8 months, and that's on a good day. And again, you're not granted protection just because, or you're not granted a registration just because you file it. There's a significant examination process. Another tip is to consider filing in the EU, your trademark, because in a lot of things, the EU does seem to be more efficient than the US, and in their trademark examination and application process, that's another one of them. So I've seen situations where marks have registered in the EU before they're even picked up for examination in the US. So if you are just gung-ho about brand registry, right, like this is what you want to make sure you get enrolled in brand registry to protect your brand on Amazon, make sure you consider foreign filing. And the European Union registration is one of the registrations that you could submit to Amazon for brand registry enrollment purposes. And there are some other foreign jurisdictions, including the UK, I think Spain and Mexico and Canada. Looking at a few of these. Yeah, Canada, Mexico, UK. UK is a little bit, y'all are in a weird spot right now because we don't know what's going to happen with Brexit. So there is some thinking that maybe, if you're selling in the UK and you don't want the expense of the EU, which wouldn't really be that much more expensive than the UK, but there might be some benefits in just filing in the UK. So, but I can't speak to how quickly UK registration would happen alone. An EU, like I said, an EU application could proceed to registration pretty quickly. So it's definitely something to think about. Another tip is really, from the outset, tightly control your distribution channels. Granted, that doesn't really help from the counterfeit perspective when you're dealing with those that are coming from China, but it does help with your gray market goods problems and all those unauthorized sellers hopping on your listing, driving down prices, messing with your brand value, making your brick and mortar distributors, angry with you. So make sure you really make those distribution agreements tight from the outset. Consider going back and reviewing the ones that you already have, making sure that none of those distributors are in breach of that agreement. If you can find any way that they are, then maybe the contracts, will be null and there won't be any, further association with the two parties, and you can, look for other distributors who will comply with the contract. So, and then at that point going forward, you'd want to have strict provisions in there about how to deal with e-commerce and Amazon. The thing is, a lot of these distribution agreements that, were formed 5 years ago are ancient. Amazon is not today what it was 5 years ago. So in those original agreements, you might not have contemplated Amazon or e-commerce, and that's okay. But, you need to contemplate it going forward. And, maybe that, like I said, is a matter of having to revisit those agreements. And then, I guess one of my really big tips to you is just really stay on top of Amazon and e-commerce. Stay educated because it's constantly changing. It's constantly evolving. There's a new program out called Transparency. I'm not sure if you're aware of it, Alex. It could totally be for another conversation. You know, always continue to educate yourself and be involved in groups like Web Retailer, and read their newsletters that come out, because there's always good tips in there, because it is an ever-changing platform. And then my final tip is to be proactive and not reactive, because it's a lot less expensive to be proactive than reactive when it comes to brand protection and enforcement.
Well, Susie, thank you very much for joining us. There's certainly some great tips there for spotting and removing counterfeiters. All that's left to say is thank you to everyone for watching, and we'll see you again for another episode of E-Commerce Heroes here at Web Retailer.